Hello everybody, welcome back to Dev to Dev. This is the wrap up of season 2. As you have seen, we managed to get to 20 episodes. I've hit a point where I feel like it's a good opportunity to take a break for season 2. Season 3 will not be far away. I've already got a couple of episodes in the can, but a series of events happened over the end of these last couple of episodes. Nobody's fault, just circumstance. That meant it felt like it was a great opportunity to take a very brief pause, reflect on season 2, and then roll into season 3 ready and raring to go. Kids are on holiday, summer break, and I've got travel coming up, so it felt like a good time to wrap season 2. It's a nice clean end with 20 episodes and move on to season 3. Before I do that, as with season 1, I wanted to take a brief moment just to sort of pontificate, if you like, on season 2. Some of you may have noticed that I took sort of a shift to try and focus on people I didn't know. Not exclusively, but predominantly throughout the season. I'm really proud that this season has many conversations with people that I've never met before, or maybe only met once, maybe virtually, sometimes, in the real world, in 3D. And that made for some really fun episodes, I found. Really enjoyed exploring people's stories and getting to know them at the same time. And I think that, that requires a different mindset, right? You have to kind of think on your feet in a different way to the way you do when you're interviewing someone you do know. But even for all the folks I interviewed this season that I did know before, there was still lots to discover. And I'm actually really excited about some of the conversations I already have lined up for season 3 that are going to focus on folks who I do know and explore their stories in ways that I've never done before and learn about them in ways that I never have before. So yeah, I think season 3 will probably will continue to have people I've never met before as guests, hopefully, if people are kind enough to lend the time. And I'm really grateful to everyone on this season that has done that, especially people that have, I've cold messaged or have reached out to me specifically. I appreciate them taking the time because I do think it makes for an interesting energy. And so, before we close the door on season 2, which will remain active while I work on season 3. I will do the same thing at the end of season 2 that I did at the end of season 1. I will archive all of season 2 behind the Patreon and start fresh with season 3. The audio versions of season 3 and the video versions will remain on Patreon. As I mentioned before, I want to try and give a bit more content to Patreon, so it's not just purely the video versions of the episodes, which I don't think are the most convenient for people. I think most people want to listen to 2 people talking, not watch 2 people talking, but the option's there, and I appreciate those that do subscribe. I hope you enjoy the video content. I really enjoy making it. Just quickly reflecting on the production of season 2, I think I've got into a really good rhythm of being able to record the episode, edit the episode, compile all the relevant materials for the episode, and publish an episode a lot quicker than I did in season 1, to the point where one episode I managed to turn around in about 90 minutes, which I'm kind of flabbergasted by. Part of it's down to the tool chain that I use is very efficient. Part of it's down to some of the processes that I've put in place throughout since starting season 1 that allow me to get content out a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently. And I really enjoy that. I really enjoy that ability to turn an episode around, generate some clips, generate content around it, get it online and planned and released. Obviously I had a couple of hiccups. That's part of the reason for taking a pause at the end of season 2. I had one episode that was good to go and then had to hold it for very good reasons, which I'm absolutely fine with doing, but I didn't have a backup and that caught me flat-footed. Thankfully somebody was kind enough to jump in and fill the void, and that episode that didn't go live will go live in season 3 once we've cleared the period that's prevented me from publishing it. But that was a bit of a lesson. Sometimes I've been very organised and sometimes it's been a little bit more ad hoc. I'd like to try and continue to improve on that. I think I did a better job towards the start of season 2 and want to continue to improve that for season 3. But yeah, I'm kind of happy and stoked that my turnaround time and my process has really matured, and I really enjoy that, and I'm applying it to other podcast work that I do as well. So that's been fun. I enjoy that. Just quickly to kind of reflect across the content of season 2, I think there's been some interesting themes when you look back across the 20 episodes. Themes of people that had a disadvantage, that ended up being an edge. Maybe Gonzo de Campo's awesome story about, working in factories for years and then finding that the processes that you learned there applied to video game production really well. Similarly, Aaron Granger, who'd gone through some VFX and animation practices and then found his way into video games and found that was very applicable. I think there's often that moment where, being a game developer clicks, right? I think there's been a trend of folks who had no idea they were going to be video game designers and ended up being them. And then those that, always knew, like Luke Shingleton towards the end, who was like, I always knew this is what I was going to do. And those have been interesting, especially reflecting on my own story that was very much the former. I've been surprised how many people have kind of commented on the idea that they needed to be a programmer, otherwise they couldn't make video games. Nathan Kelman mentioned that. So did Aram, I think. Aram as well mentioned that. 2 different eras of video game development, and they still felt that they were dependent on programming, otherwise they weren't going to get in. And then they found a version of the job that really applied to them and suited their skills. Again, that very much echoes my story. We've had some interesting stories about, how the craft of game development can consume you, how it can define you. It can become inseparable from who you are outside of game development. Johnny White mentioned that. I think Marcus Arrow mentioned that. Just ways that the job is all consuming, mostly in a good way because it's a role that we love to do, but also sometimes in a tough way, right? Sometimes in a way that can affect your relationships and affect your life and, in a negative way. I think that's been really interesting. And I think for me, Ed Moore's episode really crystallized this, but I think there's a thread that runs through all of the episodes of season 2, and I think of season 1 too, of how important empathy is. Empathy to those around you, empathy to those that do the same role as you, empathy to the player, empathy to the people you're making tools for, empathy for those around you as you focus on this role. And I think we live in a world right now where, and I think I've said this a couple of times, where we could all do with a little bit more empathy in the world. And I think it's fascinating that video game development perhaps is a really good place to learn how important empathy is. In some roles more than others. I think Scott's episode, he had really interesting insight to games built for education and how the empathy was important there. Like I say, obviously in the UX role that Ed talks so eloquently about, I think empathy is a key issue. And I think his episode probably encapsulates it the most, but I think it's a thread that runs through the whole season. And just a couple of highlights that I wanted to call out. It's been 20 episodes, so those that have listened might not remember all of the content. I loved Randy Smith Evergreen's comment in episode 1 of season 2, which I'm super proud of, where he compared his life to asking a fish about the ocean. I love that, that games weren't a passion he chose. It was just what he grew up in. I thought that was great. I thought Layla Lacombe's, this conversation about moving and how having, the Animal Crossing world village that she'd built being in the same place, wherever she moved to, that same village was there. She could jump back into it and feel at home as a way of kind of handling that. I thought that was a very human story. Like I mentioned, Brian Kindergan, believing that you had to go to MIT, and he focused on films and as a way of trying to to get into entertainment. I love Brandon Van Haren's story about building Mario levels on paper before he even knew what level design was. I thought that was a great story. Andy Roberts' wonderful discussion about imposter syndrome and how it not getting rid of it's just in the other room. So true. And I think again probably a thread that runs through many episodes is that feeling of imposter syndrome. Again, I don't think that's unique to video games. I don't think that's unique to creative fields. I think but it shows up quite a lot. Sarah Lynn's wonderful story about trying to manage being a mum and and making video games, and Louis Bayard's wonderful story about leaping into things without thinking. He called it a flaw, and maybe it was a superpower, and it certainly served him well throughout his life. And then I think Luke Shingleton's episode, episode 20, with his wonderful story about doing a job interview at the same day he was proposing to his wife in Disneyland. I think that's ultimately this podcast is about everyday video game developers, and every guest that comes on, and in the little brief that I send to everyone, I always try and focus on less about what you've worked on and the human stories of what it was like to work on them. I sort of deliberately don't spend a lot of time going, hey, when you worked at Blizzard on this amazing game, or when you worked at Activision on this incredible game, or when you worked at Riot on this. I try not to focus too much on the games and the studios, although obviously you can't avoid them being part of the recipe of each guest. I don't think that's what's important, right? I don't think that's what matters. What matters is how the guest that I'm speaking to navigated that experience wherever it is. And I think to a certain extent that makes the podcast a little bit harder to advertise and plug, right? Most people do go, hey, here's X person that worked on X big studio on X big game. That's more likely to draw people. And I know myself with some of the podcasts that I enjoy, and maybe don't listen to every episode of automatically, when I scroll through the list of guests, if I don't know who they are and I don't know what they've worked on and it's not clear, I might be less inclined to click on it. And, I struggle with that. Sometimes I think it might be sensible to really advertise who this person is and what they worked on. But I'm also aware, and have had this myself, that when that is the subject of the podcast or the appearance that you're making, it's scrutinized way more, and it puts you under way more pressure, depending on the studio, right? Depends where you work. But some companies naturally are very uncomfortable with you talking openly about what you've worked on at X place. I get that. I've done that. I've been the victim of that. I've gone on a podcast without thinking about that, and then panicked and had to have the episode cancelled a long time ago now. But shout out to Garnet Lee. But I know what that feels like, and I don't want this podcast to put any guest under pressure in that way. But I also, because I want them to feel comfortable and open to talking about their story, and not, like I say, not under the framing of this incredible game that makes people care more about your story. So I appreciate everyone that finds value in that and listens to that. I would appreciate, because of that reality, I would appreciate even more people sharing this podcast with folks that they think would like, publishing it on their network, promoting it. If you enjoy it and you find it interesting and you think other people would and should find it, I would really appreciate any help I can get, because it is going to be harder to get this podcast to more ears because of that nature. And I'm not going to pretend like I'm not going to say X person worked at X company and X, but I'm not necessarily going to say, the top line is not going to be at Blizzard, at Sony, at Xbox, at Activision, this person. It's going to be this person and what they did, and mention potentially in the hashtag or maybe in the body of the text, the company. Now, again, in the episode summaries and the blog page, there's going to be mention of the company. Of course there is. I have actually removed it in some, some posts that I've made. I've deliberately taken out a reference to the company because it felt a little, I don't know, felt a little bit like I was trying to trade on that, and I don't want to. But yeah, I think it does make the podcast a little harder to get to people. So again, any help that you can give, any reviews. I don't have any reviews on Apple Podcasts. I don't use Apple Podcasts, so I'm not comfortable or familiar with how you do it, but I know that is an area that is good to get, ratings and reviews on. So if you are in the Apple Podcast ecosystem and wouldn't mind throwing a review, even if it's just a couple of words and a star rating, I'd really appreciate it, because I think discoverability is my hardest hill to climb. I'm making slow progress, but I could do with any boost that anyone could offer, and I'd really appreciate it. Okay, enough of me waffling. This is the end of season 2. I'm going to be back next week I'm going to try and do a couple of highlight episodes and keep the podcast feed alive. It's not going to be long before season 3 starts, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe early August. I just want to get a few episodes in the can and have them all prepped and ready to go, especially while I'm traveling. So yes, again, thank you to everyone that listens. Thank you to everyone that finds value in this podcast. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone that comments. Thanks to everyone that gives me feedback. Thanks to everyone that likes and shares. Let's get the word out there, and I appreciate you all helping me do that. Thank you for listening. Thank you again for your patronage. And I'll catch you in season 3. Laters.